Good afternoon. My name is Liz High. I'm Senior Director, Strategy and Insight for Alterian. I have a long background in market research and marketing and was a founding partner of Intrepid, who were actually acquired by Alterian in September of this year. And the reason for doing that was that we had built a strong social media monitoring capability, but within the framework of very traditional market research techniques. And Alterian realized that one of the big challenges in the industry today was actually to take the technology that supported social media monitoring, but to add some traditional core insight skills around that to really drive value. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the kind of key case studies that we've done since becoming part of the Alterian group, which looks at how to bring traditional research techniques and social media research together with a very strong commercial goal. Okay? So I think in the industry there's so much today that's spoken about social media, how powerful it is, how fantastic the data set is. But in fact, one of the challenges that we meet all the time when talking to clients, and indeed with doing our own sort of research and development work, is that everybody thinks social media is very exciting, but actually proving that it has a genuine return on investment for people is a huge challenge. So again, we're accepting that for people who work in our industry, it's very important that we understand and are aware of what social media can do. But in fact, the most important thing is to really truly understand where it has some commercial benefits. So for us, the key thing that we're striving to do is to work out how to really make some strong revenue links to work which is based around social media analysis. So today, what I'm going to take you through is some core kind of insights that we've developed. And one of the really important things is that we don't believe that social media alone can tell the full picture. As people's use of digital content and sharing begins to develop over time, what we believe is that the digital world is moving much closer to the physical world, and the physical world is becoming much more ingrained with the digital world. So in fact, to truly be able to understand what it is that a brand should deliver and all the places where a brand should be present, then you actually need to be thinking about that space which is occupied where social media and the physical world comes together. And we tend to talk about this being the notion of the real world. And if you think about it, that's where brands are forced to operate commercially today. They need to understand what people are saying about them in social media, and that's where listening comes in. But you also need to remain integrated in the kind of real and physical world, and that's where we think that the true opportunity for kind of great insight in the future is where you're combining understanding from traditional external behaviors and also by listening and understanding what people are saying across the social media space. So I think one of the reasons that this project proved so powerful for CNN is what it allowed us to do is not just talk about, what people were saying about them in social media, or to talk about how people were, sharing news and ideas in social media. What we were able to do is put it into a much wider context. So what's really important to us is you can't really necessarily just view people's world through a very small and tight lens. And the whole principle of the CNN project that we're going to talk about was about taking a step back and understanding how social media and news sharing fitted into much wider and much greater brand strategy. So just to give you a little bit of background, CNN approached us with a fairly meaty business problem, which was that for some time they'd been thinking about the idea of having more and more investment in social media tools and trying to drive sharing across their sites. But quite understandably so, they were getting pushback saying, yes, but what's the benefit? What's the return on investment of building these capabilities into our website? Should we be building more tools? Should we be encouraging people to take our news out there? And of course, the theories are all around saying, earned media is the next big thing. This is what we have to be doing. sharing. But again, there was no solid business case that CNN could find in the industry, or they could look at from their internal data that was available. So essentially they came to us and said, look, we believe that we have an extremely valuable source of content. So what they refer to as their owned media. But the key question was, is there an opportunity to kind of promote sharing much more, and then have we got an ability to truly generate what we call earned media for the group? We do know by looking at our kind of data in the background that people are coming through shared links. We know that our Facebook page is generating lots of traffic to our website. We know that people are sharing our content on YouTube, but the truth of the matter is we don't really know how much. So the conversations within CNN had very much focused around the fact that we've got great content and it is being shared. But the key question is, okay, well that's fantastic, but is it generating us more revenue? So they decided to look at the key question of, if you were to see an advert through shared content, would that advert be any more powerful because it had been shared than if you had simply seen the advert through natural browsing on the website? So they came to us and said, look, this is our key problem, and we've got a series of 5 questions that we'd like you to answer. So number 1, we want to know how does new sharing happen today? What tools are people using? Where are they sharing it? What's the motivation behind it? The second thing was, is there particular types of content that's being shared? And, is it only a small proportion of our customers who are sharing? What can we learn about it? They wanted to really also get to the bottom of motivation, because again, one of the key things about the project was we needed to go from just the kind of almost obvious insights that were around already that people are sharing, and truly try and understand what CNN could do to drive sharing moving forward, because actually that's how any potential ROI had to come, was from CNN creating a unique proposition that said, we know what makes people share, and therefore here's all the things that we're doing to drive sharing. Of course, the most important thing was, what impact would sharing potentially have on advertising? And this is where we started to look in the very traditional territory of kind of ad tracking work. And the key thing was, look, we know all the sharing is happening, teach us more about it, and then make a very strong commercial link to the value of our advertising space and the advertising collateral that we can offer our advertising partners. And then the ultimate thing was to generate a business case that would show that by investing in social media and social media tools, that CNN could generate much more advertising revenue moving forward and offer a unique position. So they seem like 5 kind of fairly simple questions. But in actual fact, when we sat down and looked at the brief, we couldn't find a single tool or a single approach which would actually answer all of those questions. So we decided to look for some kind of best-in-class methodologies and also best-in-class social media monitoring tools to put together a coherent story which would answer the ROI question. So this resulted us in developing a 3-stage methodology. So the first stage of the methodology involved 2 tools, one called Meteor and one Alterian SM2, which is obviously it's our company's core tool. So the Meteor tool is a tool which, using a very simple piece of JavaScript, allows you to tag and track every piece of content that's loaded into your website and to look at exactly what happens to that, how often it's shared, where it's shared, who it's shared by, and the amount of earned media that it then generates for you. Once we'd actually used this tool to identify the content that was being shared, where and by whom, we then took that information and used Alterian's SM2 to look at the conversations that were taking place around that shared content. So essentially what we were doing at this point is saying, okay, so we know this is being shared, let's try and understand and get underneath the motivations for why that's happening. So by listening to the conversations around the shared content, we could draw some very strong indications about what people's motivations were and what they were interested in getting out of the sharing process. The second stage of the project was looking at the use of semiotics. So stage one gave us the very basics about what was being shared, where and by whom. But in order to make it truly valuable, we needed to understand what CNN could do to try and replicate and drive that sharing. So we used semiotics, which is a methodology, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, which breaks down the codes of what it is that drives people's reactions and behaviors to pieces of content or images. So by analyzing the content, the structure, the meaning, the images, etc., used in all the shared articles, we developed a code frame that said these are the key characteristics of articles and pieces of news that are being shared today, which gave CNN some really interesting tools to work with editorial to make sure that they could potentially, through the way that they write, be promoting and driving sharing behaviors. And the final stage of the methodology, which is where we brought in a more traditional approach, was we developed an advertising recall study using a simulated sharing environment. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But essentially, the idea was taking these three methodologies, so taking best-in-class social media monitoring tools, an ethnographic approach to understand and drive future behavior, together with a traditional research approach that would allow us to truly understand what the impact of all of this social media was having on advertising recall and therefore value. And the ultimate thing was developing a very strong business case for CNNI to go forward and think about their future investments. So let's go on now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the things that we learned along the way. So first of all, the power of earned media for CNN was very strong. We learned through the Meteor tool that for every unique visitor that shared a news story, 5 new unique visitors came to the website. So even at the most basic level for a publisher who's always trying to drive site traffic, then sharing is immediately proven to be a very powerful tool. One of the key things that we learned was that people who share news regularly with their networks are not necessarily reading as much as they are sharing. So for example, for every one story they shared, they got 2 totally different stories back from the network, but actually were only reading half of them. So for a business like CNN, it shows that even though people are generating and driving sharing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the things that you are sharing will be read, which means that it's so much more important that you understand what's going to drive the reading of the articles, not just the sharing. So that's really why the whole semiotic piece and getting underneath the understanding and the meaning of sharing is what's particularly important in this study. So again, in terms of trying to drive sharing behavior, it's important that we understood what the underlying motivations were. Now, this study was global, and we covered Europe, the Americas, and Asia. And what we found in terms of listening to the conversations around the articles that were shared was actually there was really subtle differences in the way that people shared in different parts of the world. So when we looked at the Americas, it was very much about humor and amusing and engaging your network. So you would tend to put a funny recommendation or a little comment with your sharing that would generate kind of a humorous base. And that it felt very altruistic. So you were sharing based on what you thought your community would like and kind of what you felt was about your friends' interests. When we looked at Europe, on top of that, they were much more likely to share things that related to their work and would actually share across their work network and have more emphasis on professional as well as the kind of humorous and networking. But there was a very strong contrast with the motivations in the Asian markets, where actually it was much more about status broadcasting. So they wanted to see that through what they shared, they were talking about their personality, what they knew, So it was much more about them than it was about sharing. So for an international brand like CNN, it was very important that we took all of those into consideration when thinking about the future development of content and kind of sharing strategies. In addition to that, it was also really important that CNN thought about the tools that people use to share. So again, what we find is that the majority of sharing still took place through conventional means, but there was a much stronger growth in the use of mobile technology. But what we find is that the tool you were using to share drove the type of content that you were prepared to share. So for example, PC and laptop users are very strong on video content. Smartphone and mobile phone, much more likely to focus just on sharing textual and low volume. So it was important for CNN to think about having a range of different formats that content could be shared in, and also not to assume, which was part of the early kind of hypotheses, that it was all about getting video out there to be shared. In fact, thinking about different channels, it was important that you had a broad range of different types of content. So those are just some of the kind of the bigger things that we learned that we're building up to the, what can we do about this strategy. So as I said, the second thing we did was look at semiotics. So in terms of the basics of semiotics, I always the example I use is there's an artist called Cornelia Parker who basically blows up things and then puts them back together again in a form of sculpture. And that's how I always think about semiotics. So essentially it's about breaking down systems and actually understanding what it is that makes people react in a particular way or to behave in a particular way. So the example that we're using here is how you would create categories out of, say, soft drinks, which is typically the way that semiotics is used. So by simply analyzing what it is about the different drinks, so for example, how they look, what the logo is, typeface, text, symmetry, you can actually start to group what looks like a random set of drinks into different groupings, which helps people to explain and understand why they react to them in a particular way. So essentially what we were trying to do in the CNN study was to look at what are the really basic things that you can do from a structure, a content, a headline, a visuals perspective to really drive sharing. So our ethnographic team and our semiotic experts spent a disproportionate amount of time dissecting and reading and analyzing all of the top 50 shared articles. And from that, they came up with a code frame, which said that based on understanding these articles, we think that there are 3 components to shareability in news. The first is the narrative type, i.e. what is it? What's the story? What kind of news is it putting across? Then you had another category, which was the underlying message. What is this article trying to achieve? What's it trying to tell the reader? And then you had another category, which was about the core themes that it represented. So by looking at each and every article that was shared during the study, there was something like a possible 120, 130 combinations. But what we actually found is that just 5 groupings of narrative, message, and theme generated over 40% of new visitors to CNN. So in terms of defining what it was that made things shareable, then all of a sudden you had a really key set of editorial guidelines, ways of writing, ways of using imagery that you could actually begin to promote as content which is highly shareable, which meant that for CNN, they could then begin to develop areas of their website, types of content that would be absolutely designed for sharing. So really where we were at this point in the study is it allowed us to say, okay, now we know who's sharing, why they're sharing, where they're sharing it, and how much new kind of traffic you're getting as a result of sharing. So if we can start building and driving certain types of articles then we know that we can drive new people into the site. So for example, this is how we use the semiotics to analyze the key article that was shared most. So if you actually look at here, this article, only 20,000 people read it just by coming into the site, and in fact 93,000 came through sharing. So that's saying very quickly that by understanding what it was that made this article sharing, we can then think about how we can then replicate that and start to create very valuable pieces of screen real estate based on the notion of sharing. So at this point, we think we're very confident around the sharing works, but now we need to prove that it has an upside for advertising revenue. So this is where we brought together a more experimental research methodology. So we approached what we called an experimental group and a control group of consumers. These were all people who shared news not only on CNNI but on other websites. Those in the experimental group were asked to put us in contact with a series of people in their networks who they would normally share. We sent them 10 articles to review and asked their people in their network to recommend 3 of the articles for their friends to read and to recommend them by their normal means. And we had a series of other people who we just sent articles to and asked them to read them. The respondents in both groups were unaware that they were taking part in an advertising study. They were just being asked to review and talk about their sharing habits and also to give some critique on the articles that they were reading. But a core part of that was then within that study, which was an online survey, they were then asked to do some advertising recall against all of the articles that we had seen and used in the study. So what we found is a very compelling difference between the experimental group and the control group. And just to give you an idea of some of the metrics that came out across the board, what we found is that the people who shared, the people who read the news stories through shared content spent 1.3 times longer on the website. They read 1.9 pages deeper into the website. When we asked them about had they seen adverts, 16% uplift occurred in terms of those that recalled seeing the adverts and correctly attributed them. And most powerful, and this is the key thing that we built the ROI argument around, is that for brand advertisers, the key thing that they look for is what's the impact of favorability of being exposed to the adverts. And between the sharing group and the control group, there was a 27% uplift in brand favorability for those brands that were seen with shared content versus those brands that were seen not in shared content. So what this allowed us to do was to take a very strong view that said CNN has a very valuable set of customers who we know are sharing. We now have unlocked the code that means we can encourage that sharing more, and we've proven that those shared customers that we bring onto our website are much more receptive to your brand messaging. So what CNN has been able to do with the project is start a totally new conversation with their advertisers, talking about developing new inventory, which is both premium priced but also premium return on investment. They are developing a set of best practices in partnership with editorial, which means that they can promote key areas of their site which are specifically designed for sharing. And they're in the process of developing an extensive review of the sharing tools that they have on their sites today in order to capitalize on this now provable return on investment argument that supports that social media and news are very strong and very good commercial bedfellows. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to taking questions.